Hello. My name is Catherine and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be going over raising venture capital funding. I am the founder of Anja Health and we are a company that is backed by Y Combinator 776, the CEO of Row, Balaji, who is famously the CTO of Coinbase, but actually also had a company for the same target consumer that my current company is. It was also backed by Harvest Ventures, Krista Galley Ventures, and in total I've raised about $5 million. I raised about $500K over the course of 6 months and it was an arduous process, but then I ended up employing the following process that I'm going to tell you about in this video. And then I closed $4.5 million in 2 weeks. So the market was definitely better then because that was in 2022 when it was a really, really liquid market and a free cash flowing market. But I think that the process really helped. So my company, Anja Health, basically helps pregnant parents freeze stem cells from their umbilical cords and placenta to use for potential future disease treatment in their family. So things like cancer, cerebral palsy, there's early research looking at autism, type 1 diabetes. My younger brother actually had cerebral palsy, so I named the company after him. His name was Andrew, hence the name Anja Health. So today I'm going to be talking about my experience fundraising and how you can also fundraise yourself. But first of all, I would ask yourself if you even want to fundraise. I think when I was looking at starting a business, I really thought that my only option was to raise venture capital funding because it seemed like all of the best founders were doing that. But really, you should stop and think to yourself if venture capital funding and being on the venture treadmill, so to speak, is something that you want to choose for yourself, because you do have a fiduciary duty when you raise venture capital funding to create a good investment for your investors. And that also means a personal commitment yourself to continuing the business for many, many years and scaling up the business to $1 billion plus, because that makes a good return. And also, there are expectations that you have to meet those returns within certain time periods. So for instance, if you hit 1 million ARR 5 years in, that's really not good enough. You have to have consistent, ideally 50% month over month growth and hit that 1 million ARR mark in a year. Then that would be considered a good venture scale business. And most startups are not able to achieve that. So you want to think about if you have enough personal indicators and personal gumption to be able to pursue this path. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I got a comment on one of my other videos earlier this week asking about the kind of catch-22 when it comes to fundraising, that it's really best to fundraise when you have traction, but sometimes you need to fundraise in order to get traction. However, I actually think that this is not a catch-22 because you don't actually need money to get traction. So I think that you can get traction in really, really scrappy ways, and the best founders are really scrappy. So for instance, I tell this story often, but one of my friends, his MVP for his startup was just getting people to Venmo him for a service that he performed. He wanted to create a fintech lending app. And so he just had people Venmo him money, and then he manually did what he wanted his software to do. And then he Venmoed them back the returns a couple weeks later. And then he kept a spreadsheet of all of the transactions. And that was his MVP. And that was a really, really scrappy way to show that he has real revenue, real customers, real demand, and that he can do things. So I think that you don't necessarily need funding in order to get traction. And if you think you do, then you're not thinking scrappy enough, is my personal opinion. Anything that you want to do, even if it's hardware, software, whatever it is, you can dumb it down to something that shows that there's at least some indicator of demand in the market, because VCs need to have that kind of conviction. So you can show that. And I'm going to use this analogy a lot, but I honestly think that fundraising is very similar to dating. And likewise, when you go on a first date with someone, you want some early indicators that you would want to go on a second date with them and that you would want to see them again. If you walk away from the date with literally zero indication whether or not you want to see them again, you would think that's a weird date. So you don't want to meet a VC without some kind of indicator that you would be a good investment. And that might be a personal prior accomplishment, or sometimes even like an institution that you're attached to, like where you went to college or an accelerator or whatever, is a good enough indicator for a VC. But I think that you can potentially gain traction for your business in a way without a brand name. So the point is that you don't really need to be attached to a brand name. You can prove yourself regardless of what people tell you about who you are, what you do, etc. You can do anything you set your mind to. Okay, now for the actual fundraising process. So you want to start the fundraising process 3 to 6 months before you actually want to fundraise. So during this time, you can reach out to people yourself through cold outreach, but I would also keep a CRM of the people that you want to reach out to and who might align with your values. And then you can start sending this list to other people so that you can get intros to them if you do not want to do cold outreach. And I think sending a list is really important when you're asking for introductions, because I get a lot of founders reaching out to me saying, "Hey, I'm fundraising. Do you know anyone?" And I would just be like, Yeah, I literally know a bunch of potential investors, and you can Google a bunch of potential investors, but I don't know who might be good for you. So you can help the person that you're asking for an intro if you have a list. So I typically ask people when they ask me for introductions or they just say they're fundraising, do you know anyone? I ask them, do you have a list? Because then that can help me help them to get to people that would likely fundraise or would likely invest. And a way that you can build your list is by looking at Crunchbase and seeing other companies that are similar to yours or in your industry. And you can reach out to those investors because then there's signal that they've invested in something similar. You can also see if they've invested in any companies recently because then there's signal that at least they're deploying capital. You can also network and potentially ask people if they know anyone that aligns with their industry. And there's a lot of investor lists kind of floating around tech Twitter and things like that. That's how you can find investors in a 3 to 6 month period. For me, this was immediately when I quit my job and started the company because I wanted to have a source of income and I didn't want to be dependent on my parents or anything like that. And I wanted to be able to feel free. Freedom is really important to me with everything. So immediately when I quit my job, I started DMing people on Twitter. I think if you're not on tech Twitter, you need to get on tech Twitter. The way to get on tech Twitter is to just start following founders and venture capitalists on Twitter, and you'll realize that there's a whole community there and everyone is really willing to help and it's really easy to make connections. So you should definitely start there, especially if you didn't come from a prior network like an Ivy League or accelerator, etc. And so when I quit my job, I just started DMing people on Twitter like crazy, saying I'm building this, Anja Health, and we help pregnant parents. And similar to dating, I specifically chose people that I felt like would align with my personal values. So I specifically chose people that were interested in media building or had a track record of building a brand themselves, because that was what I started to do at Anja Health. Our very first growth experiment and the way that I acquired our first hundreds of customers was through me making TikTok content and other types of social media content. So I wanted to find other people that would be able to advise me on how I was doing this. I also reached out to people that spoke really heavily around parents' rights, children's health, things like that. So that's why Alexis Ohanian, that ultimately became my investor through 776, the amazing fund that he founded. I reached out to him because he has a mixed race child, and being mixed race impacts your ability to get a stem cell match. He also was really outspoken about birth and feeling empowered at birth because his wife had a traumatic birth experience. He also is really outspoken about building a brand, and a lot of his personal brand is being a business dad. So being a parent is a big part of his identity. And because of that, I was always really set on making him a part of my journey, whether it was as an investor or an advisor. I just really wanted to get in touch with him because he seemed like someone that just aligned with what I wanted to do in so many ways. And I just really, really, really wanted to get his feedback. So I started cold emailing him pretty much as soon as I founded the company. And I would just hit him with emails, even with no response. I would hit him with emails, so many emails, and each one had an update that I felt proud of and also a reason why I felt like he would care about the update. Like I would say, we did this and I felt like you would be interested because I know this about you. I think that that really resonated. And I did the same thing with Balaji, who is the CTO of Coinbase, but he actually also did a genetic testing company prior to that ultimately sold to Myriad Genetics, which is one of the biggest genetics testing companies for the prenatal space. So he's used to selling to pregnant parents, and he's also a big thought leader. So he knows how to build a brand. So similarly, I was hitting his line every time I had an update with something that I felt like would be related to him. I would hit him with an update, and I just started doing that randomly. I didn't really have a timeline around it. It's just when it popped in my head, I would treat it like I was updating a friend. Even with no response, I would keep texting because I am shameless. And I did that with quite a few people. And actually, most of my investors I reached through cold email. So you don't need a prior network to fundraise successfully. But you do want to start doing this pretty much as soon as you decide to be on the venture path. Or even if you don't, it's a good way to connect with mentors. But generally, that's the way to go. And then when you actually do want to fundraise, at that point, you have a preset network that you can reach out to. During this 3 to 6 month period, when you're in a way courting the investors that align with your values, don't say that you're fundraising. You can say that you're potentially considering it in the future, but I would just be really vague about it and just make sure that they align with your values and truly just get to know them, let them get to know you. So I'm going to talk about the actual process of setting up the fundraise next. I mentioned about 3 to 6 months before you want to fundraise, you want to start networking to set up that initial feeler with people that align with your values. But then about 1 to 2 months prior to the fundraise, you want to start reaching out to those same people and even more people in order to schedule calls during the actual fundraising period. So I think you should define a fundraising period. You want to pick a date that is a 3-week long period. And during these 3 weeks, you are going to commit to 4 to 7 calls a day every weekday for those 3 weeks. And that will be your fundraising period. So I think that that specific period is really, really important because all of this networking that you do 3 to 6 months in advance and the outreach that you start to do 1 to 2 months in advance to schedule all of those calls in that period is really in order to make sure that you have enough calls in those period and that they are in the right order. So you want to have the investors that align the least with your values at the beginning, and then you want to do the investors that align the most with your values at the end, because gradually, regardless of who you are or what you're building, your pitch will get better as you do more pitches. So you want to do the best people that you care about at the end. And if you gain momentum and you find that the fundraising is going really well, which happened to me, then you can move those calls up and it creates more of a sense of urgency and a greater sense of momentum. Like basically what happened is I didn't even actually schedule a call with the investors that I really, really liked until I already had a lot of momentum with investors that weren't my number one choice. But then I was able to reach out to my number one choice and say, hey, I have XYZ offers from these people. So I really need a decision in the next 24 hours because you guys are my number one choice. And then it created a sense of urgency and momentum. Urgency and momentum is really what fundraising is all about. Investors just want to see as many signals as they can that they're making a good investment. And the best signal beyond personal conviction and you as a founder and your company is seeing other investors invest in that company. So like if everyone else is doing it, then they're kind of like, let's do it, must be a good investment. There are a few investors that are amazing independent thinkers and do not get caught up in the FOMO and such. I think Alexis and 776 is one of those, but for the most part, momentum is generally a good signal. So you do want to make sure that you have that structure in place. Okay, so now when you are reaching out to set up those calls, what you can do is have a really catchy tagline as a subject line in your email. So mine, for instance, was founder 70K plus on TikTok reaching out because I had 70K followers at the time. And I felt like that was a really catchy subject line. And I was able to get people to respond to my cold outreach that way. I wouldn't even say that you are fundraising when you reach out. You just want to connect. The reason for that is that you never want to explicitly say that you're fundraising, because if you say that you're fundraising and you don't appear to have all of that momentum and things like that, then you may be judged at that point. So you want to basically keep all the cards closest to your chest as possible. And so just reach out and say, I'd love to connect. Can we jump on a call during the fundraising period that you chose? Even if it's 2 months in advance, you want to start doing that outreach 1 to 2 months in advance because you want to make sure that you have enough time to reach out to people to stack all those calls, 4 to 7 calls each day for 3 weeks. So in that 1 to 2 months, you reach out to the people that you've already been networking with in the 3 to 6 month prior period. And then you reach out to the people that align with your values, also the people that may not align with your values, and you schedule them accordingly in that 3-week period. So the first week should be least favorite investors. The second week should be like mid-tier interest on your part. And then the third week should be your favorite investors. And so you reach out to them and say, I'd love to connect. Can we connect on this period? It's not weird if you do it that far in advance. You should just do it. There will be no explanation. There will only be reputation. Taylor Swift. So the reason that this 3-week period is so important as well is because fundraising is a full-time job and it will take away from your business. So the best way to use that time most efficiently is to just dedicate yourself wholly to fundraising. And if you only do like 1 call a day, you will still feel like fundraising is a full-time job. So you may as well just take more calls in that day so that you can most efficiently take advantage of the time that you have. Another thing to note is that when you're doing this outreach and scheduling the calls is you should make sure that the decision maker is always on the calls with you. Sometimes those people have the title of partner. Sometimes everyone has the title of partner. So you just want to make sure that you do enough personal diligence, especially on LinkedIn and things of that nature, or just network and ask around to make sure that the decision maker is on the call with you, because if they're not, you're going to end up having to do a series of calls in order to eventually get to the decision maker, and things might get lost in translation because you will not be personally the one convincing the decision maker, and it will instead be someone that is not a decision maker convincing the decision maker that you are a good investment. One piece of wisdom that I've gotten is that when VCs get on a call, they are looking for a reason to say no, because their goal as a VC is to take as many calls as they can, able to see as many investments as they can so that they can make the wisest investment decisions. And if you have a greater supply of potential investments, then you can be really choosy and also gain more knowledge and have a broader network, which is really the goal of being a VC. So they're looking for reasons to say no as you're pitching. And one way to give them a reason to say yes is the language that you're using during the call, but also to make sure that the decision maker is actually on the call so that they can say yes directly directly to you, and you can assuage their doubts in person because you're the best advocate for yourself. Next, you want to set up your spreadsheet prior to that 3-week fundraising period. So a spreadsheet, according to Ryan Breslow, who is the author of Fundraising, which I think is actually a really, really good book on fundraising, despite the fact that he's very controversial. So his recommendation is to create an investor CRM that basically tracks the firm name, the target investor, which is the decision maker, the last touch point you've had with them, the next step with them, and also interest level that you gauged, and then general notes. So I use that investor CRM, and I use that fundraising period process where I did 4 to 7 calls a day or every weekday for 3 weeks. And basically by my second week, I closed $4.5 million and we were starting to say no to checks. Granted, there were really good market conditions. This was in 2022 and it was before the market crashed in 2022. But I think that part of my success was also due to the process. So now let's go into the actual pitch and what you say to VCs when you are on the call during your fundraising period during this 3-week period that I'm talking about. So in the book Fundraising by Ryan Breslow, he says that the best way to get to know an investor is not through a deck, but through dialogue. And I actually agree. I think a lot of people typically think that you have to have a deck, but a sales advisor to the company once told me that the person that has the best time in the meeting talks the most. And you obviously want the VC to have the best time in the meeting. So it's best to encourage them to talk the most. And it should really be a dialogue as opposed to you giving a full pitch, walking through your slide deck for like 20 minutes. They get bored, they're zoning out, etc. So you want to start the conversation by asking questions. You can always make a question relate back to your business. So for me, I would do a very, very brief pitch. And then I would go into, do you happen to have any kids yourself? Have you heard about the fact that you can freeze your baby's stem cells from their umbilical cord and placenta? Did your OBGYN inform you about it? Based on their answer, I would have different responses that would slowly inform them about the business. So for instance, if the answer was yes, I have heard about cord blood banking before, then I would ask them if they chose to do it or not and why or why not. And then if the answer was no, I have not heard about cord blood banking before, then I would say, okay, well, most parents have not heard about cord blood banking before, and this is why, and this is how I'm going to solve it. So I would ask questions and create a dialogue and then follow it up with information about the actual business. Also, especially at the early stage, a lot of investors are really looking to invest in the founder themselves because at such an early stage of the business, even if you have traction, businesses and markets change so quickly that you can pivot. Businesses are hard, so they're looking for people that are resilient and smart and will be able to make it through a pivot and any market changes, and someone that they can trust to make good decisions when the going gets tough, because it will get tough when you're a founder. So for a similar reason, you want to have a dialogue so that they can see who you are as a person as opposed to just you presenting a deck. So it would be very akin to if you went on a date and instead of conversation, they just presented all the reasons why they would make a good partner. And then at the end of it, it's like, you don't even know who they are. Like you can get to know who they are through the dialogue and through questions. Like that's just a much more fun interaction. So I think in that way, it's best to have a bit of a dialogue. So what I would do is I would have talking points, and I had a investment memo ready that was basically a Notion document that had the information of a deck, but I would kind of walk through it and make sure to hit all of the points throughout my questioning. And then if they were really insistent on seeing a deck, I would only send it after I had pitched them if they indicated interest and if I felt like I could trust them with that information. So I would send them my investment memo at that point so that they at least had something to refer back to. But again, you should be speaking with the decision maker. So I would only send that to the decision maker so that they can advocate on your behalf. Another way that fundraising is similar to dating is something that I talk about in my previous videos, especially my How to Be Confident video, is that the framing should not be when you're dating, do they like me? Why don't they like me? The framing should be, do I like them? That is what you should be thinking about when you're on a date with someone. So similarly, when you're pitching an investor, they are determining all of the reasons that they should say no to you as an investment. Because if they're a good investor, they're seeing so many pitches and they don't want to be investing in every single thing. And so similarly, you should have the mentality of, why would this investor be good for me? Do they align with my values? I mentioned earlier that you should be courting in a way 3 to 6 months prior to your fundraising period. And you should be courting investors in particular that align with your values. So you should be determining on these calls if they do indeed align with your values, similar to dating. Even if you've already had a couple of touch points with them and things of that nature, you want to make sure that you are gauging if they're going to provide value to you. You can ask questions like, how is it to work with you? Do you have founder references? Do you believe XYZ? You can see if they see the world in the same way that you do. So you should be making sure to ask those questions towards the end of the call as well. And also I would make sure to ask on the call directly, do you want to invest in this business? this because you want to get to an answer as quickly as possible in order to efficiently close your fundraise. So that is really, really important. Never end a call without asking directly, would you like to be a part of this round? You can preface that with, I would really like you in this round because it seems like we really align value wise and I respect this and this about you. But you always want to ask at the end of the call, do you want to be a part of this round? Because that is the best way to get to a quick decision. And if you're bold enough to ask, I think that's the best thing. So similar to dating, at the end of the first date, you really would like, I think, if you like someone, then it would be a good outcome if the other person said like, oh, we should do this again sometime. How about next Tuesday at 5 p.m.? And it's an activity that you like, for instance. Like you just want that direct follow-up about what the next step is. So that is really important at the end of your pitch call. Okay. And then after the pitch ends, you can choose to potentially send the investment memo if you would like, but you don't necessarily have to. If they really press you on it, when you ask directly, will you invest? They might say, oh, I have to think about it. Can you send like a deck? That's typically the response that I got. And in those cases, I would send the investment memo if I like them. Otherwise, I would just say, I don't have a deck, and I would smile, and that's it. There will be no explanation. There will only be reputation. Can you tell that I'm a Swiftie? So I also wanted to discuss fundraising terms. I think a lot of people inquire about terms on a call typically. So you want to make sure that you have this in mind prior to a call. So terms of investment is basically what valuation you're raising at and how much you're raising. And a valuation is determined by the traction that you have and also the market at the time and the industry that you're in. So typically for an early stage company, I would say it's around like 5 to 10-ish. And typically people raise like 1 to 4-ish. And the proportion of money raised over valuation is generally the equity that you're giving up to the investor. So that's important to keep in mind. And I think a lot of founders make the mistake of being stingy with equity when making these decisions. But in reality, if you have $1 billion exit, these proportions will not matter so much because you will make it either way. And the reality is that it's likely that you will not make it because most startups fail. Unfortunate truth, but true. So you should just do what is good for you. And you definitely want to make smart decisions, but I wouldn't be too stingy about, oh, I'm giving away like 7%. Is that too much? I think that's a big mistake. Some people like to raise a certain amount and then they try to raise it a really high cap for this reason. They like to give away less equity. But if your cap is too high, then you set up the expectation that at your next round, you have to raise an even higher cap. And you want to make sure that you can justify that in future rounds. I would do a mix of asking ChatGPT, asking investors, asking other founders in your network about what exactly you should be raising at, especially based on the industry that you're in, et cetera. And you can set your valuation and terms that way. And then in terms of amount raised, you want to give yourself enough room to be able to operate for 2 to 4 years. So I would do like rough projections and make them very generous. And then in terms of the actual contract that investors sign whenever they say yes is a YC standard safe unless investors negotiate for a price round, in which case you should consult an attorney for sure, but you should be consulting a startup attorney either way. But a YC standard safe is available online and you can send it via DocuSign. And then after that, you send the wire information. So that's basically the entire process of having investors send you money. So you want to make sure that you have your C Corp bank account ready to be wired immediately, because at the end of your calls, when you ask, do you want to invest? The best case scenario is that they say yes. And then you immediately follow up with wire instructions and the safe at the same time. Or you can send an angel list link if you're wanting to invest through an SPV, which is basically they do all of that for you and you can just send a link. But that is better for smaller checks and angel checks as opposed to fund checks. You should do the YC standard safe. You want them to be able to send the money immediately because getting the verbal yes from an investor is honestly meaningless. I mean, it's definitely a good signal, but they could still back out at that point. And until the money is in your bank account, you should consider it a maybe. I've had investors promise me over $1 million and then literally ghost me. So you just never know what could happen, and you want to be prepared to have them wire you immediately so that you can hedge against this happening. Alrighty, so that's how you run a successful fundraising process. I really think the momentum part of having a lot of calls in a short period is the key to success, because that is truly running a genuine process. This really helped me close the round really quickly when I was raising my seed round. When I was raising my pre-seed round, when I first started the company, I was just DMing people on Twitter here and there, taking calls here and there. It lasted for months and I barely raised any money because I never had any good updates around the fundraise. Like every time my investor circled up again with me, I would just be like, yeah, I've only raised maybe like 100K more, versus when I did the 2-week fundraising period, every time an investor followed up with me 48 hours later, I would have an update of I've had 8 more conversations and 2 of them said yes. But by the end of the fundraise and even the 2 weeks, even though I allotted 3 weeks, I just had all the money that I needed and I started saying no to checks. So that's an important thing to remember. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful, and definitely comment below if you have any questions.